Mark Littlefield.
Karen Bronga.
Scott Myers.
Zach Johnson.
Anna Brawley.
Christopher Constant.
And on the phone, we have Mr. Martinez.
Yes, thank you.
And anyone else on the phone?
Felix Rivera.
Oh, all right. Thank you, Mr. Rivera. We'll get your nameplate up there.
Thanks,
Oh, and Ms. Salatel, thank you. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. And of course, members, please text me if you want to get in the queue or raise your hand and I'll manage that process. So first we will have our standing report, and I'll just note also, we have a couple kind of substantive topics on the agenda, partly for giving members information, not necessarily with any immediate action, but we wanted to make sure this committee is a good learning environment. So first we'll start with our standing reports and unfinished business. Do we have our Budget Advisory Commission chair here or on the phone? I don't see him in person. Okay, I don't think he's here, but I will share, there's been some effort by the Budget Advisory Commission. They've had some challenges getting their meetings publicly noticed and making sure there's support. I know there's some, I think, turnover in OMB. So I've been working with the administration to get that figured out. So hopefully they will have a meeting soon, and we are working on that. So that's the update. But I also believe they are almost fully not staffed up, but fully seated up, their members, which is great because I know they were having challenges with quorum. So that is in lieu of an actual update from the BAC for now. Next, I will just briefly check if there's any update on ARPA. This was one of our standing items, but there may not be. But if there are any, please go ahead and share that. See Mr. Thurn and Mr. Bryce. Yeah, and again, it can be brief. These are just really if there's anything you'd like to share.
The word brief is never associated with me. But I will do my.
Please remind us who you are in your role right now.
Alden Thurn, Director of Internal Audit. Just to give the brief update on ARPA as I continue to work on that. We are in the process of completing our fourth quarter of 24 quarterly report. The good news is there were a variety of appropriation being moved around amongst the different projects that were there. Everything's looking fantastic in the right areas. So that's important because there was a requirement to make sure that all ARPA funds were obligated by the end of 12/31/24. I'm looking at it. I'm real happy with the way the numbers look, and I think they're going to be coming out fine. The contractor continues to work on his pieces, and we're moving forward. That's probably from a reporting standpoint. From the operational standpoint, as you know, all of the money was given to subrecipients long ago. Most of it's being spent, and the ones that needed a little extra time, their contracts were extended through the normal process. Everything's signed, sealed, and delivered on those, and I think they're continuing to work towards the spending of their money. And at this point, I think we're only around $4 million left to be spent across all of the $103 million that we got at the end of the fourth quarter. So I think we have until the end of 26 to be able to accomplish that. So I think we're actually looking very good on ARPA from both a compliance as well as a reporting standpoint.
Questions from members? Okay, I'm not seeing any and not seeing it on the phone. Also, folks on the phone, if I missed your text, please speak up verbally as well. So then our next item, let's move on to our report from the MOA Trust Fund Board, and we have Mr. Slivka here, so go ahead.
So thank you, Alex Slivka. I'm chair of the MOA Trust Board. So brief history, the board was put in place October of 23, and we've been meeting and organizing for the last 15 months. The portfolio itself continues to generate returns in line with expectations. I would say two things. Our next meeting is going to be February 14th. And also to give you a heads up, we have been working very closely with the CFO's office that we have a very minor revision to code that we're going to put forth that just deals with the description of the MOA, the trust manager. And so you'll see that in your queue coming up. It's just a cleanup from what was put in place a couple of years ago. That's all, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, questions from members? Okay, I'm not seeing any. I do actually have one question though. Can you remind us what basically what money went into the trust and what is its scope? Because I know we have a few different trusts, and maybe that's something we could do a longer briefing of another time. But really, what specifically is this trust fund? Thank you.
So this trust fund very specifically is the proceeds first of the sale of the AT utility back in 1999, 2000, and the sale of the ML&P here more recently in 2020. The total aggregate value as of now is roughly 440 million. It generates pursuant to code a 4% payout, which approximates 16 million a year that goes into the budget.
Thanks. So it's really a dividend for general government.
Correct.
Thank you. And then to your knowledge, sorry to dig into this point a little bit, to your knowledge, is there any prohibition on putting new money in it? Obviously, we would need to have that money, right? But if we had new revenue at some point, could that continue to contribute to the corpus?
I am not aware of any prohibition limiting people from contributing money to the trust.
Okay, thanks. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think we have Mr. Bowman who also wanted to answer that question. And then unless there's other member questions, we'll move on after that. So go ahead, Mr. Bowman, when you're there.
To the chair, we've looked into that. There is no prohibition on the assembly adding new money to the trust. It can come from any non-otherwise dedicated source. It has been done in the past when there was a particular surplus of funds at one point. So if the assembly ever so wishes, they could just dedicate money to the trust. It would transfer over and it would go into the stewardship of our board of trustees.
All right, thank you. So we'll store that information away for another time. Okay, next, I don't see any other questions on the phone or in person, so let's move on to our MOA financial reports. And I know we have our CFO, Mr. Bryce, and we are getting a few handouts. I believe the handouts, some of these are on the topics we'll get to next. But if you want to also point us to any documents to look at, please go ahead, Mr. Bryce.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. I do not have any specific report to give you today. This is my first meeting with you guys, and I just learned about this meeting yesterday. So unfortunately, I don't have much of any information to give you, except that I have spoken to the treasurer, and he was mentioning to me yesterday that usually between this time through June, he doesn't do much of any reporting on the revenue side of things for obvious reason, because we are still trying to figure out what the real number will be per se.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that really was the question I was going to have is given that we're at the beginning of the year, really just general timing wise, when might we see a kind of more full picture of where we ended in 2024? And then when would we maybe start seeing, for example, the revenue reports for 2025?
I believe that could be probably delivered to you somewhere in February, beginning of March, more than likely, yes.
Okay, thank you. And then in the meantime, are there questions from members? I don't see any. Okay, so we will look at a future meeting then for updates on where we ended in 2024 and then looking ahead to this year. Okay, well then that is pretty quick. So next, let's move on to, and actually before we do number 5, OMB, I just want to also note, if there is any update on the ML&P closeout, we can talk about it today, but that's also one of those standing items that we want to not lose sight of, but we don't need to actively discuss necessarily. But so I will mention that, and then I will turn it to Ms. Browse, our OMB director.
Just as a quick update on the ML&P closeout process, the administration is working through the Center for Treatment requirement that is part of the stipulations of the sale. And so as that is explored and sort of the direction that we go in with that, we'll be bringing that information forward to the body for that conversation relatively soon. The deadline is October of this year in order to determine what we're actually going to do with the $15 million requirement. So, okay, what part are we on now?
Thank you. Yes, we are on the OMB report. So if you want to just briefly introduce yourself for the record, and then just to close out that other conversation on closeout, I will note maybe that is a good information topic for February, but if you need it to be later, then we'll make sure that we make time for it in the committee, whenever it's appropriate. And then go ahead. So we're on OMB update.
OMB update, I will say that currently we are a little further understaffed than we were in the previous year. We lost our admin coordinator, and so I apologize for the lateness of the documentation, but we are making some changes and bringing some new staff on board, and we'll have additional capacity by the end of this month. So we're looking forward to that. But the budget update right now, we are working through the approved books. We're going to finalize all of the detail from budget passage at the end of the year, and then the approved books will be produced. And so you will have new budget detail around specific numbers that you guys approved in November. And as we go into the 1Q process, we will be meeting with departments and checking in with them about their projections for 25 and what we expect to see, if there are any changes that need to be made. We have a list of things that are to be considered both from the assembly and from the administration. So if there are developments over the next few months that you get from your constituents or from your work, please let me know if there are budget needs associated with that. But we will be working through the 1Q process in February, March, and April. Questions?
Questions from members? I don't see any on the phone as well, so I think we can keep going. But yeah, we're in that time before we know what happened last year fully, and then before we know what's happening this year.
And that's actually, that's a good segue. The timeline of producing budget to actuals, the November budget to actuals are the last in the year that are usually available, because once we get into December, the final payroll of December is split. So half of it is in 24 and the other half is in 25. So that process takes a little bit longer to go in and back out the expenses and separate them by year. But and as we are working through the year-end accounting, it takes a little bit longer than the costs while we're in the year. I think the budget to actuals process will be reportable again in February and March. And that's when we'll see the sort of more refined information about where we actually landed in the year. It's not the audited information, but slightly better every day. So.
All right, thank you. I'm not seeing other questions, so I think then we can move on from our reports into our two substantive topics, and then let's, I guess I don't have a preference, but we have the BSSA Building Safety Service Area listed first, so let's go there.
Okay, I think BSSA is longer conversation maybe, and SEMT may be faster. So I think if we want to take the beefier one.
Okay.
I apologize. I don't have a PowerPoint. It's just 2 pages of presentation material. So we can work from paper if that's acceptable.
Yeah, so we're starting with the SEMT. Go ahead.
Oh, SEMT. You want to do that? Okay. So the SEMT program started a few years ago. It's the supplemental emergency transport reimbursement that we get through the state. It is a program that we can apply for on an annual basis. It does require an ACFR as part of its application, and that has been one of the major delays in sort of receiving those revenues. As far as I know, the funding is a secondary reimbursement on top of the already received Medicaid reimbursements that the municipality receives. Once they go through their traditional annual process, we're able to compile the numbers and go back to the feds to say we want supplemental reimbursement for the gap between what we received and what we are still missing. And so once that program became eligible at the state level, the municipality started activating the applications for it by compiling all of their operational information at the fire department. And the page that you have in front of you, one is the summary of what the ambulance service fee account is within the budget, and the other is the SEMT account, which is where we receive the SEMT reimbursements. But the ambulance service fees is the fund where we accrue the ambulance service throughout the year. The little screenshot there is from the state website. That is the language that the state produces to administer the program. It's federal pass-through dollars. And the dollar amounts at the bottom of the page are what have been received since the program was implemented and we started applying for the funding. The 2022, 2023 timelines, even though the years of application were 2019, 2020, is because of the delays in Act for Production and also the challenges around getting the initial application filed.
We have a question for Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, thanks. Looking at the numbers for the monies we have received, 2019, 5 million, then it goes up to 18 for a couple of years, down to 12. I mean, is that kind of, is there a normal range of variability we should expect there? I mean, does it have to do with sort of how just truing out the math or different, levels of calls for service that impact how much we bill? What kind of determines sort of where we land?
If you'll see in the second paragraph under ambulance service fees, there's, I think the third sentence says that, that the number of transports remains stable, but the reimbursement method of those transports or the payor method of those transports is what varies and then can impact what the SEMT reimbursement is. So if we have more full payments from insurance or private sector, then we would have a smaller gap for SEMT to come in and cover, even though the Medicaid number hasn't changed. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. So,
But
the
to
ver-
answer your question, it is a little unpredictable.
okay, that works. Thanks.
There are questions from members? I guess I'll ask one as well. So we're talking about the revenue side. Can you remind us where the SEMT money goes, what part of the budget? And then I'll also note that I know at least part of it is funding the mobile crisis team. So maybe talking a little bit about that too. And also just really touching on the question about variability. How does that affect our budget year over year?
To the chair, I will say that I may get this slightly wrong. Maybe you or members Alatel will remember how to correct this exactly. But previously, I believe the SEMT was brought into the budget just as general government revenues. And a year or two ago, the Assembly chose to direct the SEMT funding to remain within the fire department. And so that the revenues that were being, operationally received by the fire department were being used within the fire department. And to my knowledge, that is where they remain, is under the fire department operations. But that's part of our budget exploration, is to determine how that variability in funding affects our budgeting over time. And because it's a new program, as every year that we go through, as we're analyzing the data, we're able to see and predict those numbers a little bit better, I think. But the delay in the reimbursement process has been challenging in terms of the reliability of receiving that revenue at a known point. We are looking at the time frame between when we submit the applications to the state and when we receive the money from the state, and what that time frame looks like, and if there are any sort of outlying impacts to delays there. We're currently set to receive the 2022 reimbursement in first quarter of 25. And once we are caught up with our ACFR process, I think that that 2-year split will disappear and hopefully become less than a 1-year split.
Thanks. Any other questions from members? Not seeing any. So yeah, I think that's a good, helpful overview of this, and that way folks know kind of what this is when it shows up in the revenue mix.
And if we need a further exploration of it, either on the operational side, or we can schedule a second session with AFD and other, information available.
Okay, well, I think we're ready to move on to our other topic then, the BSSA.
BSSA, which is very different than the BSA, which is also challenging sometimes. The Anchorage Building Safety Service Area. I think many people either know that there is a building safety service area, or we know that there is a building fund, and these are interchangeable terminology, but the Building Safety Service Area, you see the map on the page, the dark portion is the BSSA within the municipality. And you'll see the two notes on the side. Inside the BSSA, you go to the permit center and pay for everything if you touch a building and move a building and redesign a building. And outside the BSSA, the land use permits are required for buildings and additions and changes. But a lot of the other permit fees associated are not required outside of the BSSA. The code section there shows the establishment of the BSSA and what the in section C, building safety services shall be provided within the Anchorage Building Safety Service Area. So that sets the building safety service area and all of the associated activity within it. If you turn to the second page, this is the Building Safety Service Fund. So this is the fund that receives all of the fees associated with activity within the BSSA. Down the left side, you'll see each one of these categories of contributors. And in the annual columns, the 2017, 2018 column, you'll see percentages off to the right of each of those columns. Those percentages represent the total amount that takes up the space within those categories. So the top category is the cost, and the bottom section are where the revenues come from. So if we're looking at 2017, the labor line, which is the top line, you'll see that 78% of the cost in 2017 came from labor. And so that's how you can read it across. It's every year from 2017 through 2025. These were the actuals, not the budget. So this is what was actually spent for sort of an easier look as opposed to what was budgeted versus what was spent. And the totals across the bottom stay, within relative boundaries of their budget and themselves over time. The revenues section, you'll see that 44100 building grade clearing permits, that's 48% of the revenue markers. So that is where the bulk of the money comes from that goes into the BSSA. The labor associated with the BSSA fund is all of the positions and proportional amounts of positions at the permit center and other jobs that perform the revenues collected underneath it. So one of the challenges is I think about 15 years ago, the structure of the way that the BSSA fund was cost and recovered changed. So prior to 15 years ago, the BSSA had usually an annual mill levy in the budget that would collect anywhere between 0 and 0.5 mils or 1 mil, depending on the year, in order to attribute funding to this BSSA measure. About 15 years ago, that line item was removed from the budget and the department became entirely fee supported. So the challenge that has been created is that the labor costs don't match the revenue that's coming in. Labor has increased at ideally a CPI rate, and the fees and fines under the fund have not increased over time. There have been a couple of adjustments in the fees associated with the permit center over the last 10 years, but certainly not enough to keep up with the inflationary increases and the labor increases that eat up the bulk of the cost section. So if the question is, is this sustainable over time? You look at the bottom, the revenue accounts line item, the dark line that on 2017 column starts at negative 5.3, and you'll see it grow over time. We get through deficit operations, it continues to grow. And if we run over the revenues that we have, that money is then borrowed from fund balance to pay those bills because they're labor costs and must be paid. So the BSSA fund goes into more deficit. 2 years ago, I believe Director Lechner and the Assembly worked with the CFO in order to reinstate the mill levy within the BSSA in order to sort of prevent some of this deficit from growing. The challenge with it is that it does become a tax cap conundrum where we are billing for a deficit to recover for that there may be other ways to restructure to recover for. And I think that's the point of having this conversation. What are the ways that we can prevent the deficit from growing? Is it the mill levy? In 2024, the mill levy was 0.045. In 2025, the Assembly approved the mill levy of 0.05, which is a total of 1.7 million in collections that will assist to remove that deficit. A lot of talking, sorry.
That's okay. No, this is good. I think it's a sticky problem. Member Zalatel, you're in the queue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So my question is, what does it look like just to take this in-house and just pay that we have a building safety services counter and this process? Like, what does that mean for our budget? Because we did it for a number of years and that's how we have the BSSA deficit. And so I guess what I would like to know over time is kind of what is the recommendation of the municipality? Continue and try to catch up on the account and continue to levy, or should we look at a way to try to wipe the past debt out and find a new way to move forward? And how structurally hard is that to do?
Through the chair to Member Zalatel. I'm not sure how structurally hard that is. I think the changes would come after analysis into how the proportionality of the positions are attributed within the BSSA, whether or not those positions, when originally incorporated in the BSSA, still are valid as only BSSA charges. I think that things have changed over the many years since the BSSA was created. And there is likely, it's somewhere probably in the $1 to $2 million range, I think, in order to get closer to making the problem go away. But we can look at what the restructuring would look like if we were to delete the dedication of revenues and the requirement of the BSSA fund being the only support for those labor costs.
Okay, I guess I'm curious how that would look, because we obviously did it for a number of years when we weren't issuing the tax levy. I mean, we obviously paid those individuals, we absorbed those costs, and I know it's writing on our books, but we paid them. So that was literal cash out the door. And so I'm curious, kind of the intersection of those two things, what did actually occur in the past and how we can maybe do that the right way in the future.
Yes, and through the chair to Member Zalatel, I think that our next layer of research is going to be exactly that, to go back to the time prior to the revenue change or the sort of dedication change, and look at what was in the BSSA and what was covered by the costs, and whether or not there was any structural deficit at that point in time, and sort of make the best choice in the path forward. I think that it could involve lots of different kinds of options, right? You can get rid of the building safety service area. You can change the building safety service area. You can delete the dedication of the positions only to the building safety service area. I think that there are job duties that are performed by the permit center that are not specific and only within the BSSA. And so should those jobs only be paid out of the revenues from the BSSA, I think that is the analysis that we need to know whether or not the tax levy is the appropriate mechanism to fill the gap. And if it is, then we should increase the tax levy to make sure that the BSSA does not run at an annual deficit and just try to recover the amount that we are currently in deficit. To your point, Member Zalatel, about the sunk costs of the labor moving out the door, and we went through this for a number of years, and it's been in slow accumulation. I think that that's also true. There are avenues to explore in terms of, is it possible to cancel that debt? Is it possible to, reassign it in another area? What does that look like? And we haven't fully explored the answers to that. I mean, some of them, of course, maybe no, but understanding what the options are is what we are looking to next to figure out how to resolve the very long-standing BSSA challenge. So if we need a part 2, we can come back with the next one with more robust historical information and some options for consideration.
Yeah, I think that is definitely of interest. And I know that'll take some time, so we're not looking at that for next month. The other part I want to connect to this conversation is housing. So I had a conversation about, because basically the other way to fill this is if we got a bunch more permit fees, right? And so I think there's an interesting kind of, it was no one's intention, but there's an interesting perfect storm of, we're building a lot less, so we're collecting a lot less of these fees. And I think that also contributed to the structural deficit. And it's not the only cause, but just to note that those are related. And I think we've also heard, as you said, there's some positions that are tied to this. And so I remember having a conversation with a staff person in the prior administration that there was a decision not to fill those positions for a while. And I don't know if that's still the posture. I think that would be helpful to know. But also we know there's challenges with the permitting process, and some of it is staffing. And so these are all, I bring it up because these are all related. And so it's going to take a while to untangle. So I guess the other question I want to raise right now, though, is one way to solve this is to really jack up permit fees, right? And just say, we're going to make everything cost 5 times more. And I'm not arguing that's a good idea, because that is directly contrary to all of our other goals around housing and development. But I also want to just flag this, because I think if there's discussion about waiving permit fees, that this situation makes that harder, right? And so that's really the problem that we're in, I think. And so anyway, I just want to raise, like, are there, as we think about solutions, has that been discussed, or how do we do that? And then, of course, as you said, this is also under the tax cap. So just jacking up the mill rate immediately is also not an option. But anyway, just, I don't know if you have initial thoughts on that, or how, because when we come back to this conversation, I guess where I'm going is I'd like the conversation to also involve the permit center in some way, because I think it's there's not one part to the solution.
Yes, and that's actually a great question, because if you look at the column for 2024, that is the only column on the page that includes both the budget and the actuals within it. And the reason for that is because the scenario that Member Brawley or Chair Brawley just brought up is shown. So if you look at the labor line at the top of 2024, you'll see that the budget was 6.3. We had budgeted $6.3 million for everybody who works within the BSSA fund. But the actual spend, unaudited, unfinished because of split payroll, et cetera, the actuals was 5.9. And so the amount that we had budgeted was not actually spent all the way out. So we saved a lot of money in labor vacancies, as Member Brawley was talking about. And if you move down to the other highlighted line on 44100, shows the budget of $3.3 million. We were budgeting $3.3 million for those fees to come in from that service. But you'll see that our actuals currently show 4.7. So we received a very large amount of revenue in our building permits outside of our budget, and we underspent on labor. So there was a really nice sort of coincidence of timing that helps the BSSA recovery in 2024. To Chair Brawley's point, we don't necessarily want to keep vacancies alive. We need people to do the work. And so that reality is shown from the last year's activity. The different scenarios that I think we can envision on ways to resolve this are, what would it look like if we had to increase the fees proportionally in order to make up the entire labor cost or the entire cost of the services within the BSSA? What would it look like if we only assessed mill levy and put the fees and fines into general revenue? What would it look like if we made labor adjustments on the proportionality of who is charged where for what time? So I think that there are a handful of different ways to think about it. And some of them may be really bad and some of them may be really good, but we'll find out. And the other part of that is that any subsequent conversation about this, I would love to involve the permit center and the people who work out there specifically to explore each one of those options. I think that they have the firsthand experience to tell us what is probably the better lived experience there.
Other questions? Yep, go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
And maybe this would be a better question if we had people from the permit center here, but I look at sort of the different services for which we collect fees for the BSSA, and it's pretty broad. I mean, how are those fees set? Does it have to do with just the scale of the project, or which different people have to review it, you know, electrical, gas, whatever? Does it have to do with the type of projects?
Through the chair to Member Johnson, my depth of knowledge extends to a yes. I think that a few things. One, the fees are published and registered at the permit center, and they generally usually are proportional to the size of the project, the amount the project is going to cost to build. If you're proposing a $500,000 house, your permit fee is proportional to that valuation. So when we have larger construction projects, we're going to get bigger permit fees coming in. When we have more construction projects, we're going to see more permit fees coming in. And so I believe that most of the fees are set in code and adjusted by the assembly as that comes forward. We can also bring the detail on when the fees were set and at what the increases were, et cetera. So some of them may be, you know, set in code, and some of them may be set by the department. We'd have to talk to them to figure out specifically.
Okay, thanks. And then are the fees structured in such a way that they're meant to be a reflection of the amount of like staff time that goes into reviewing it? Like if I look at like, well, a 2,000 square foot single family house is going to require so many hours versus, 6,000 square foot multifamily or renovation versus repair. I mean, is that kind of how we get to these numbers, or are they more sort of somewhat reflect philosophical choices about where we want to collect revenue?
Through the chair to Member Johnson, I believe the answer is both. I think that the analysis of the actual staff time that is spent on each different kind of permit is probably pretty variable. I also think that the fees associated with that do not necessarily tie to the labor costs associated for each person who touches a review as it goes through for what their proportional time is. And that would need to be part of the analysis too, is how much are we actually pushing through on a senior planner time and the, counter time, et cetera, et cetera. And to be frank, I don't know if that's already how they contemplate the fees, but I do know that the fact that the fees have not changed in line with the labor changes would sort of imply that they are not.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, other questions? Okay, I don't think I have any on the phone as well. I guess my last question on this is really, I think obviously a big topic. We'll have multiple options. What do you think is realistic, or what could we drive towards in terms of the first quarter budget revisions? Because I think so when we dealt with this last year, it was in the first quarter budget revision as we were setting the the final mill rate and what we had room for. So I think that's really maybe the question, and what would be realistic for you guys?
I think depending on how the rest of the first quarter budget plan works, that either coming back to budget and finance or doing a work session in March is probably the best timing for that. If we have updated information and specific proposals on how the BSSA might be able to adjust in first quarter, then I would want to have that conversation with you in early mid-March before we actually get into the contemplation of the budget and voting.
Okay, then yeah, I would assert, again, not that it is the position of the assembly, but I think this is something that we need to continue working on. It does obviously relate to our housing and development goals and staffing issues. So yeah, I think if we can find a way to at least put this in the mix of possible priorities, that would be helpful. And then also heads up to folks, if you were contemplating a fee holiday, this is what you have to deal with. So on this particular area.
Well, and to your point, Chair, I think that that's actually really important, right? The conversation around housing in the community, I mean, this is what we see at the municipality as far as revenue associated with direct construction and changes within our permits. But if we wanted to be able to sort of incentivize, we would need to be able to figure out how to cover some of these costs. And so we would be coming at the first step of recovering the deficit and the second step of getting through to how to sort of subsidize some of those costs, and how should those be subsidized? And is there a proportionality based on project, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, all good things for us to chew on as we move into the new year. Okay, well, I think, I don't know if there's nothing else on the agenda to discuss today. I'll just see if there's any members that have any issues, not seeing any. I know Mr. Littlefield had to head out. Oh, Ms. Branca?
I'm not afraid to act ignorant.
Neither am I.
So the numbers in parentheses, I would assume are negative. You know, they're spend that's greater than what you anticipated, but then I'm looking at the one place where you had 2024, where you had budgeted and actuals, and the
They're
budget
both.
is in parentheses, so that got me confused.
It's relative to the spreadsheet. So the top section is the costs, and you'll notice that none of the costs are in parentheses. So if you travel from line 1 down line 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, you get to, if we're looking at 2024, you start at the $6.3 million labor line, total up all of those costs, you get to 8.2 or 8.3. And then all of the numbers underneath it are in parentheses to be shown as a deficit or a decrement to that $8.3 million. So you read down the page, it's the numbers up at the top are all the actual expenses. And so what you're trying to see, because we're running at a deficit, is that the number at the bottom is less than what we are expensing.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, we'll pick up this conversation at a future meeting. And last, I will see if there's anybody in the audience who'd like to give audience participation. Okay, I see mostly staff back there, so that's fine. So I think with that, we will adjourn, and then we'll be meeting again next month. So thank you, everybody.